I never totally know when the live screen starts, because while I talk, it still shows me the screen, but I think actually it's going on earlier. And so my name is Carsten Schradin. I'm a director of research in Strasbourg at the CNRS. I'm one of the co-hosts, and it's a great pleasure for me to invite Peter Kappeler. But I already want to give you quickly a few what's coming up the coming weeks, when we have to next week talk by Dan Blumstein about the marmots in the United States. Then Christina Riel coming with a fascinating talk on birds, Kay Holcam on hyenas, and Marta Manza with the meerkats. And then you don't see it here, but in December, we will have more talks on invertebrates, on spiders, and on social insects, as we are quite interested to have a diversity of taxa here within the audience. But today I'm very happy that Peter Kappeler is going to talk to us, because his work has been fundamental for my own research, especially his paper together with Carl van Schaik from 2002 in the International Journal of Primatology, where they proposed this outline of how to study social systems by differentiating between its three components then, that's social organization, social structure, and mating system. And in a paper by Peter from last year in behavioral ecology, he added the care system to this. So for us, this has been fundamental to understand how to look at the own social evolution. But of course, also his empirical work, especially on lemurs, on oil lemur, on Cerogalidae, has been very important. And he has been studying for many years in Madagascar, where he has a research station at Kirindi forest, and studying apart from lemurs, also mongooses like the fossa, but also more recently chameleons. So he's a broad zoologist, and he studied zoology at the University of Tübingen in southern Germany. It also puts me very close to him, because you're from the same area of Germany, and we realize when we move to other areas of the world, somehow where you come from, it forms the way you think and you feel and interact. So it's also something that I have in common with him. But he very soon left Tübingen to study at Duke University. He collected data there for his diploma thesis, which these days would be called master thesis, and then later his PhD on female dominance in lemurs, a very interesting pattern. As in many lemur species, the females are dominant over the males. Then when he finished there, he came in 1993 to Göttingen as a postdoc. He worked there at the German Primate Center before he became a professor for a short period at the University of Leipzig. And then after less than 1 year, returning to Göttingen, where he then became a professor. And he was one of the first people who worked together at the University of Göttingen and the German Primate Center, which is a separate research institution. And it's very important that it started that these two research institutions really work more closely together. And since then, he has been also a head of his research group. And like I said, developing this research station in Kirindi Forest. One important thing that's worthwhile mentioning, and because he said it was such a positive experience, was that in 2016, he became a fellow of the German Wissenschaftskolleg that is called the Institute of Advanced Studies. They give fellowships to around 40 to 50 people worldwide, scientists from all disciplines, to go and live for 1 year in Berlin together with fellows from all the other disciplines, to work on a topic and to interact on a daily basis with people. That can be somebody who studied anything in social sciences, in physics, chemists, anywhere. And he said, very interesting and rewarding experience to spend this year and together with these other scholars. And the Wissenschaftskolleg, the Institute of Advanced Studies, pays during this year that you are replaced at your home institution, so that somebody else, for example, takes over your study duties. And everyone from all over the world can apply to become a member of this institute. And that is something that might be of interest for several people here, and that you should keep in mind. So Peter has published way more than 200 papers, several books, including an important textbook about behavioral ecology in German. He also, very importantly for our entire field since I think 1997, I wrote it down somewhere, he is organizing the Göttingen Freilandtag, an international meeting that happens every 2 years where people from all over the world are invited to discuss one of the hot topics in behavioral ecology at the time, something that gives the opportunity for people to meet and interact, young scholars and old scholars, something which we try to achieve a little bit here with the find now in a different stage. So he really has done a lot for our field, and I'm looking very much forward to a very interesting talk by him today about lemur social evolution, which has an impact, I can promise, not only for lemurs, but for all other taxa as well. Peter.
Thank you, Carsten, for this very warm and personal introduction. I'm afraid people can also hear where we come from, not only guess based on other cues. So it's a great honor to be with this group today. And thanks for joining on this hopefully historic date today, which Carsten failed to mention. For me, the invitation to contribute to this lecture series was actually like a prompt to think about the actual topic, which is the frontiers in social evolution. And so before I go on and talk about some of my own work on lemur social evolution, just to prepare you for what's ahead of you in the next hour, I wanted to outline a bit what I did in terms of following up with respect to this mission. So if you think about frontiers in social evolution, the first thing that's sort of puzzling to me is the term social evolution, because it's a strange phrase, at least in German, and because evolution cannot be social or asocial. But I guess we all know that it refers to two different topics. One concerns social behaviors that have fitness consequences for conspecifics, and the other one, evolutionary changes of social systems. And so I should apologize first that I will only be talking about the second aspect today, leaving the first meaning to some future speakers. And so when we think about evolutionary changes in social systems, I guess each one of you has a favorite example in mind. There are many well-studied groups, both in the invertebrate and the vertebrate world, where these changes have been documented and examined in detail. So there's no doubt that social systems evolve, but the big question is, how do they evolve? Because clearly we are talking about an emergent trait based on the input of many different individuals. So it's not the system itself that is the target of selection. So we fortunate enough to have colleagues like Karen Kapheim, who's been doing some fascinating work on sweat bees, who has informed our standing of the mechanisms and processes of social evolution tremendously, because with these animals, it's possible to look at, genetic sources of variation of different behavioral phenotypes, but also more recently, developmental processes that generate similar variation among individuals. And as we know, as behavioral ecologists, there's also environmental input from the social and physical environment that prompts individuals to exhibit individual variation. in terms of how they behave. And this variation is then evaluated by natural, sexual, and kin selection to produce, if it's a successful recipe, some genetic change that we can follow and document, and ultimately link to patterns across species. So this also leads us to a more fundamental question, namely, how can we study social evolution? Because clearly not everybody is in a position to do these fancy genetic and developmental studies that people working on some invertebrate systems are able to do. And so I think that's also an important component of approaching the study of social evolution. And clearly the best and most straightforward way is always to do experiments, which in this case might involve artificial selection for some behavioral traits or selective breeding over many generations. But if you look around in the literature, this approach is actually limited to, at the moment, to particular behavior patterns of some invertebrates. And so it's not been widely used to study social evolution. As Carsten already discussed a few weeks ago, the fossil record is also, of very limited use because behavior does not easily fossilize. So that's also not very helpful. And instead, we can look for intra-specific variation, like Carsten and his students have been doing so successfully, to understand, the sources and patterns of variation that exist that may be informative. But in general, outside the work done by Carsten, there's still too little emphasis on intra-specific variation. Finally, we can also explore variation among species in comparative studies that will inform us about cases of parallel or convergent evolution, which is defined as unrelated organisms evolving structures or other traits with similar function, which will inform us about some underlying general principles and processes. And so these comparative studies, as we've also heard in an earlier talk in this series, are a very powerful tool for identifying patterns, mechanisms, and also inferring processes in social evolution. But the question is, given this, definition of convergence, what can or what should we actually compare? Because the definition includes both a reference to relatedness, so we have to look at unrelated taxa, and the question is, how unrelated should they be? And then obviously there's also a question about time, because evolutionary processes take time. And if we think about one well-documented example, perhaps one of the first one that was published in the 1990s, which is a study of the evolution of the social organization of old world monkeys, where the authors found essentially no variation in the key components of the social organization of species like baboons and macaques over something like 20 million years, at least in most of the well-studied species. So there's not much happening here. If we look instead to a very recent study, came out a few weeks ago, examining an adaptive radiation of African cichlids, where some aspects of their social systems that you can see down here, like the mating system and aspects of ornamentation have been linked to their diversity. In that case, the authors also did not find any striking signals in this explosive radiation. So the question is, are we then really confined to these classical textbook examples, you know, comparing ichthyosaurs with dolphins or placentals with marsupial mammals, which might be a bit cumbersome and frustrating. But this is fortunately only a rhetorical question, as highlighted by a paper that was recently published on these Mexican cave fish that you see over here. Their population was subdivided into different isolated cave systems for a very short period of time, in evolutionary perspective, less than 1 million years. And within this time frame, they evolved very different and patterns in aspects of their behavior, but also in the neural structures in their brains. So that's actually reassuring then, because it shows us that adaptations can happen very rapidly and even within species. So I think that's an interesting first frontier in social evolution to identify the relationship between social systems and phylogeny. And most of you know that historically in the study of animal behavior, there was a particular application of this relationship in that classical ethologists like Tinbergen and Lorenz used aspects of the social system like courtship displays and other aspects of the behavior to try to build phylogenies, like of the duck family in this case. Now, the examples that I just presented a minute ago, actually looking the other way, with the assumption that in this day and age we have very detailed phylogenies available from based on molecular data, so that we can use the phylogeny as a given or as a good working hypothesis and try to map social system traits onto that to try to reconstruct the evolution of traits of interest. But there's yet one additional twist on that, and thanks to Luca, I am able to talk about that as well, a study that I only discovered today about the evolution of rodent mating systems, which is quite extensive, and where Barry Sinervo and colleagues found, among other interesting things, that the mating system seems to have an effect on speciation rates. So in this specific case, they found that whenever there was a transition towards a monogamous mating system, the taxa following this event or evolving this event diversified almost 5 times faster than species with a more promiscuous mating system. So in other words, we cannot only use phylogeny to look at patterns of social evolution, but obviously there's also another correlation in that the aspects of the social system are drivers of speciation, making this, I think, a very interesting general relationship to examine in further detail. And so in particular, I think if we have a good phylogeny, coming back now to this more widespread attempt of trying to reconstruct social evolution on a given phylogeny, like of the cichlids again here, we can do various interesting comparisons at a smaller scale of taxonomic divergence, but it's then also possible to look at, bigger picture questions by conducting contrasts with various meaningful outgroups. And so these types of analysis are really interesting because they can inform us about the kinds of traits of a social system that are very resilient to change and others that are perhaps more flexible and readily change. And evaluating this mix of responses will then also inform analysis of convergence and show us also perhaps cases of divergence where different solutions have evolved. So despite this one example that we briefly looked at a moment ago, from a theoretical perspective, I think adaptive radiations should be interesting study systems in this context because they are characterized by, a situation where there are new opportunities, where they are, where some species are released from natural selection and then also released from ecological constraints, leading to rapid diversification and rapid speciation. And fortunately, there are many groups that have undergone this type of adaptive radiation in different taxa around the world that are potentially available for such studies. And so I think in addition to the morphological diversification that has traditionally been studied, I think about the Galapagos finches and other examples, I think we can and should also ask whether the same effects can be seen in the social systems. And so this brings me to my narrower topic today, which is located in Madagascar, an island off the coast of Africa that has been separated from the mainland for more than 150 million years, during which most vertebrate species, at least that we find there today, have reached the island in separate waves of colonization, often followed by such an adaptive radiation. So as a result, the flora and fauna of Madagascar today is characterized by remarkable diversity in some taxa, and especially in the vertebrates, in the non-volant vertebrates, also by very high levels of endemism. And so this is not surprising because there are numerous well-documented examples of the fauna of Madagascar, like in the amphibians, in chameleons and other reptiles, but also in some bird families that have undergone one of these classical adaptive radiations. In terms of the mammals, we find 4 groups there that arrived over the course of about 40 million years in separate waves of invasion. And of course, the most famous and most important ones are actually the lemurs, the primates of Madagascar, which are now an endemic group there. And lemurs are cool, of course. They're cool animals. And the sad thing is that they were identified as the world's most endangered group of mammals in an IUCN assessment about 10 years ago, as you can see here. And the sad thing is that the reassessment, the most recent one earlier this summer, has indicated that the situation has become even worse classifying more than 90% of all lemur species as endangered species. And there are multiple reasons for that, and you can see just a few of the obvious ones from our neck of the woods where we can witness that development as well. But I don't want to dwell on that depressive or depressing topic today. Just an important reminder, and I'll actually come back to that point at the end of my talk. So for those of you who, despite all these Hollywood movies, don't know lemurs that well, a brief summary of this group of primates. So here we're looking at a phylogenetic tree of all the primates, their major groups, and as you can see at the basis here is this radiation of lemurs based on the radiation following their successful colonization of Madagascar back in the Eocene. And today, this group of animals is divided into 5 families, 15 genera, and the latest count is up to about 120 species. And these animals, as is the case for many adaptive radiations, are quite diverse in several key traits. So we have the smallest known primates, a 30-gram mouse lemur, which is actually endemic to our study site, and a 10-kilogram indri, which is the largest living species. Mind you, there are also a number of species that went extinct since humans colonized Madagascar. So here you see the skull of an indri and some skulls of these other beautiful, huge lemurs that matched or rivaled even silverback gorillas in body size. They're also quite diverse in terms of their activities. So we have nocturnal species, we have so-called cathemeral species that are active day and night, and we also have strictly diurnal species among the lemurs. Similarly, in their life histories, there's across species great variation in the number, developmental state of the infants at birth, variation in litter size, also longevity. Smaller species like this mouse lemur in the field live on average 3 years. In captivity, some of the cat-sized species can easily reach 30 years of age. And so the question then is, what about their social systems? Are they equally diverse? And what happened during this adaptive radiation? And this is actually the big question I want to address today, also the question that has guided much of my research agenda over the last decades, I must say, at this point. So the question whether the representatives of the lemurs on Madagascar show convergent patterns with some of their ancestral species and other primates, especially with the African counterparts. And so this work brought me to the baobab forest here in Western Madagascar, where we set up a field station in Kirindi forest in about 25 years ago. And this field station has since grown quite a bit. You can see it from space over here. And it's consists mainly of 2 study areas where we put in trail systems covering, 230 hectares, 130 kilometers of trails. So it's quite extensive, and it allows us to study the various inhabitants of Kirindi, both day and night. And the main stars of our work there are the 8 sympatric species of lemur that you see depicted here. So again, the smallest primate on Earth, which is a nocturnal, solitary, and now also critically endangered species. You can see that we have in total 6 other, or a total of 6 nocturnal species. The size range is from 30 grams to 3 kilograms. And fortunately for our purposes, we have a diversity in their social organization, including solitary, pair living, and group living species. And over the course of a single day, if you're lucky and patient, you can see members of each of these 8 species sitting or doing something in the same tree, which is quite convenient for comparative studies. And so today, Kirindi is actually the largest remaining tract of this dry deciduous forest in Western Madagascar. But it's also home to several other species. And as Karsten mentioned in his introduction, some of my students and I have also investigated the social systems of some of the local mammals, like the fossa here, which is the biggest carnivore, another species of mongoose. But there are also some very interesting, fascinating bird species that we've been working on. And as Karsten also mentioned, the latest project is to radio track chameleons, which happen to have the fastest life history of any tetrapod. So that's a challenge. And that's a different story. But the reason why I'm showing this is also to make reference to another aspect that Karsten kindly mentioned in his introduction, which is this conceptual framework, which is simply the result of the necessity of having a clear idea of what you want to compare if you're studying very diverse types of animals, and you need to be clear about what you're studying and what you're calling what. And this is something that has also been discussed already in some of the previous talks, so I don't think I have to go through that in great detail today. So the big question here is then, can we find general principles when we compare the social systems of the lemurs with those of other better known primates in terms of these 4 components of the social system? And that's something that has guided my own work over the last couple of years. But because of time constraints, I can really only talk about our studies on the social organization today. And this is something that was still pretty much terra incognita when I started my own field work as a young postdoc in the early 1990s, because there were some reports, notably by Jean-Jacques Peter and his team, who provided the first qualitative descriptions of lemur social systems. And then there are only a handful other pioneers whom you may have known or heard before, like Alison Jolly and her ringtail lemurs. Bob Martin did the first field study of mouse lemurs, Alison Richard of the sifakas, and Bob Sussman of the brown lemurs. And so when we studied our field studies of the lemurs at Kirindi, the social systems of these small nocturnal animals was, virtually non-existing, or Bob Martin's study provided really the only reference point for us. And so what we did was to import methods from small mammal research and starting to live trap these individuals, so we could manipulate them, we could measure them, weigh them, get all kinds of samples of body tissues from them, and then release them to get, again, marked with a microchip or equipped with a radio collar, so we could follow and study them in more detail. And so in the early years of our project, we actually focused on the studies of the social organization of solitary species. And the main sort of surprising result then was that, you know, there's variation. Solitary is not the same as solitary in another species. So for example, in these cockerels, dwarf lemurs, I found that female home ranges cluster tightly and, you know, mutually overlap, whereas the male ranges are widely spaced out. The study of the smallest primate, Malambert's mouse lemur, by former PhD student Melanie Damhan, revealed just the opposite pattern, that the female ranges here are pretty much separated from each other, shown in red, and the male ranges overlap widely. And the sister species, the gray mouse lemur, first studied by Manfred Eberle at our site, revealed yet another pattern with both male and female ranges overlapping mutually with those of other males and females. So lots of variation here. And another key element of the social organization is the, you know, sex-specific dispersal pattern, and the default expectation for small mammals is female phylopatry. And looking at, again, at the ranges of these cockerels, dwarf lemurs, we can see that animals or females, which are the circles that share the same color, which refers to mitochondrial haplotypes, are also clustered in space, indicating that, you know, daughters stay in the vicinity of their mothers. And Barbara Wimmer, in her PhD thesis, essentially showed the same pattern in the gray mouse lemurs, where notably the average relatedness of adult female diets with home range overlap was much higher than for any other type of diet. So there's good evidence that in that respect, these lemurs are doing what other solitary primates tend to do, even though Ute Radespiel showed for at least one other mouse lemur species that this is not necessarily so. Moving to more recent work on these gray mouse lemurs, which are solitary foragers at night, but they spend the day in tree holes, often in company of conspecifics. And so my recent PhD student, Luis Socias Martinez, and my current postdoc, Clémence Poirot, came up with the idea of studying the sociality of these animals during the day. And because it's difficult, but not impossible, to find natural tree holes, they also offered them artificial tree holes, on a large scale in the same area. And because all these animals are microchipped, we can now visit these nests and nest boxes on a daily basis and determine who uses them as a shelter during the day. And here's a first summary of the occupation of these nest holes that Clémence just put together for this talk, showing for the last 2.5 years simply the sex composition that you see over here, whether there's one female, two female, multiple females, single males, etc., male-female pairs found on any given day in these nest boxes. And without going into any detail, what you can see that there is huge variation among seasons, there's variation among years, there's then also variation from month to month, and we're only beginning to develop the methods to begin to adequately describe the variation in how these animals aggregate and organize during their inactive period of the day. And these nest occupancy data also then provide an opportunity to use more modern method like social network analysis to analyze in more detail who is, spending time together on a more regular basis, how stable are these sleeping groups, what's the genetic relationship among their members, etc. So moving on to pair-living species, here our studies revealed an interesting, unexpected type of convergence at the level of lemur families. Oliver Schülke, as a PhD student, was the first to describe the social organization of these fork-marked lemurs, which is characterized by a home range overlap of one male and one female, but very little interaction, very little time spent together in daytime shelters. In fact, if you compare it to more classical anthropoid pair-living primates like gibbons and these langurs here, where you can look at the average inter-individual distance between a male and a female, we could show that these fork-marked lemurs never spend any significant amount of time in close proximity to each other. That's why we call them dispersed pairs. And Roland Hilgartner in his PhD was able to show exactly the same pattern in the red-tailed sportive lemurs, the lepilemur, Ruficaudatus, which is a member of a different family altogether, but these animals have converged on this very exceptional type of social organization. Quickly moving on to the group living species, there's a number of things worth mentioning here, just based on some earlier comparative work of literature data. It's striking that the group living primates of Madagascar live in much smaller groups than primates in other parts of the world, that these lemur groups are characterized by, on average, even adult sex ratios, whereas the anthropoid primates' adult sex ratios tend to be female biased on average. And if you start looking at the composition of individual groups, it turns out that they're actually quite variable. So these are summary data of species typically classified as group living. And you can see, well, indeed, over 50% of the time, a group consisted of multiple males and multiple females, but we also found these other constellations on a regular basis. And this is something I want to evaluate a bit more in detail by quickly looking at one of our group living species, Verreaux sifakas, which we also started darting and individually marking 25 years ago, so that it to radio track these groups, also collect behavioral data and other samples on a regular basis. And we have multiple adjacent groups of this species, which are interesting because their group composition over the years turns out to be very variable. And it, in fact, includes all the types of social organization that one can think of in terms of the composition of these groups. So in green, for example, you see the frequency distributions of male multi-female groups. Here in red, you see the number of groups that consist of one female and one or several males, etc. And these groups are then also quite variable in size, with an average of about 5 adult individuals. And Katja Rudolph, in her recently completed PhD, looked at the correlates of this variation in group size with the hope of finding an ideal group size or an optimal group size for this species. But if you look at variation across groups with different sizes, there's no significant difference in the average home range size, distance traveled, foraging, resting activity budgets, also fecal glucocorticoids as some measure of perhaps stress experienced by these animals does not vary as do the counts of their intestinal parasites as a function of group size. However, what we nonetheless observed is that this variation in group size has fitness consequences. If you look at variation in the number of adult females in a group, which varies between 1 and 4, and just look at the probability that any of these sexually mature individuals will give birth in a given year in these seasonal breeders, you see that there's a clear effect that with increasing numbers of females, individual reproductive success tends to decrease. So a clear indication of female competition, which also has consequences then for female behavior, because in very rare occasions, and there are like 2 handfuls of cases after now 25 years of study, we see adult females leaving their natal group, going somewhere else. And if you look at the number of females in the target groups, most of these females go into a group that has no other adult female, in parentheses, because it was lost to predation and there was a breeding vacancy, or there was maybe only one other female. So moving on to the red-fronted lemurs, which are the, if you remember, the second group living species in Kirindi, see how they deal with these problems. They are not quite as variable in their group composition, because actually most groups over the years consist of multiple males and multiple females. So we have an average group composition, group size of 7, 8, 9 adult individuals, including both the males, which give the name to the species, the red-fronted lemurs, and the females. So if we look at potential female competition in this species, again, looking at the number of co-resident females and their probability of reproduction, we don't really see a strong effect because these groups typically contain 2 or 3 adult females, and they don't really differ in whether they give birth or not. But if we include total group size in an analysis looking at the probability of reproduction, we actually found that total group size is in fact the only significant predictor of the probability for these females to reproduce. Now, what females of this species are doing is quite interesting and puzzling in that these females occasionally, but regularly, evict other adult females, or sometimes also juvenile females, from their group. And the graph on the left over here shows you that the the distribution, frequency distribution of these events over some of the recent years to show you that this is happening regularly. And again, to emphasize, these are no voluntary emigrations. These are females that leave the group in response to intense aggression by other females. If we collapse these data on a calendar year, there's also some weak seasonal pattern that you can see if you want to, because they mate here in late May, early June, and then give birth in late September, early October. So there tends to be at least small peaks in that area, also pointing in the direction of female competition over reproduction. And so what we have here is different solutions to the same problem of female competition. In the sifaks, we have either one or two females in a group, which very rarely, but sometimes disperse voluntarily. There has never been a case of a forceful eviction. They, once they enter into a new group, they also reproduce there. But the competitive effects are only visible among the females that are co-resident within a given group. Whereas in the red-fronted lemurs, we have, slightly more adult females on average, no known case of voluntary emigration, but we have these regular evictions at critical group sizes, and these evicted females are not able to successfully immigrate into another group. So it's basically a death sentence for them. So as a result, there is very fierce competition over group membership. So these females try hard to stay in a group to earn the right to reproduce. So trying to summarize some of the main things that we've seen so far, looking at solitary pair living and group living species, there is some convergence with other primates in that we also find, the details of the solitary social organization and variation in that. That's reminiscent of what we know from bush babies and lorises, for example. These solitary species are also, as in other primates, exclusively, in other strepsirrhine primates, exclusively nocturnal, and also female phylopatry is quite common. In contrast, these dispersed pairs were the first examples for this type of social organization described for any mammal in the meantime, and Carsten and his student Charlotte just talked about this beforehand. It's also very similar patterns being described in elephant shrews and some other mammals that look quite reminiscent of what we found in these lemurs. But then also noticeably, in terms of the group size and composition, the group living lemurs clearly differ from these other primates. As I said, I won't have time to go through all the other components of a social system. That would be separate talks altogether, but maybe just to briefly orient you. So we found similar evidence for similar adaptations to sperm competition when we looked at the mating system, also reproductive skew distribution in these small groups, at least among the males, very similar to what we find in other species. And also male sexually selected infanticide has been reported in several species, but they differ in that respect in terms of a correlate of the mating system, in that all lemurs lack male bias, sexual size, and canine dimorphism. In terms of the social structure, there are also some similarities in terms of female bonding that one can find, but more striking are divergent components like the fact that even closely related adult females never form coalitions. In fact, they even evict closely related relatives. When you look at male-male relations in lemur, they're in many cases noticeably amicable and tolerant. And the major impression that already Alison Jolly pointed out was the fact that in most of the lemur species, females are able to dominate the adult males in their group. In terms of the care system, that hasn't been really examined carefully enough, but we also find, patterns of infant parking and carrying as in other strepsirrhines, and parental care is primarily provided by females. So that also seems to be convergent here. If we focus on some of the traits that are highlighted in red over here on the right, they collectively in their combination refer to something that I called the lemur syndrome a few years ago, because it characterizes members of both the lemur family and the Indri family that are group living. And as you can see, these traits also distinguish these lemurs from other better studied anthropoid primates. And so that has been something that has been in the focus of much of lemur research over the years, and various explanations for this lemur syndrome have been provided, like trying to link it to environmental factors and trying to explain it in terms of life history adaptations. It's been referred to as an idiosyncrasy of sexual selection exclusive to lemurs. There have also been some more proximate explanations focusing on endocrine parameters, and also some crazy ideas linking it to the notion of an evolutionary disequilibrium, because so much of the current fauna in Madagascar seems to be only the tips of the iceberg of more species that went recently extinct. So a few years ago, Claudia Fichtel and I tried to take a fresh look at all these ideas and put everything into a coherent story, which we termed the Eco-evo-devo of the lemur syndrome. And I just want to briefly summarize that. So it's all based on the observation here by Duar and Richard, which looked at rainfall data in Malagasy and Southern African weather stations, looking at the predictability and variability in rainfall. And as you can eyeball here, Madagascar is in that respect really different from other areas of Southern Africa. And so our reasoning was that this seasonality, which is predictable, together with the climatic unpredictability, would then translate into unpredictable phenology of important food resources. But on top of that, this unpredictability is still predictable because of the pronounced seasonality. So you know that there's going to be a food limitation this year, but you just don't know exactly when and how long it will last. But in any event, it creates energetic and social stress, especially for reproducing females. So there's scope for female competition, which may then also explain these cases of female evictions. We know from studies of other mammals and even other vertebrates that gestating females that are being stressed physiologically tend to produce masculinized daughters. And so our reasoning was, if this happens over and over again over millions of years and generations, that there would be such an evolutionary canalization of this chronic filial masculinization, because these mothers that produce masculinized daughters would have a competitive advantage. And so this chain of events could then, increase the absence of sexual dimorphism, explain the absence of sexual dimorphism, the relatively small group size, also the pattern of female dominance over males, and other aspects of this lemur syndrome. So obviously this is an attempt to create, a coherent explanation with testable predictions, but of course, over many of these aspects are difficult to test empirically, but at least, it's out there and people can sink their teeth into it. One obvious question following from this type of explanation is, what about other Malagasy mammals? So remember, there are also 3 other radiations that made it to Madagascar. And so if this story is true, then it should not only, the conditions there should not only apply to the lemurs, but also to the tenrecs and the carnivores and the rodents that are endemic to the island. And so together with Steve Goodman and Charlie Nunn, last year, we compiled data on sexual size dimorphism for all these Malagasy animals and for the closest living relatives of each of these groups on the African mainland, so the golden moles or the sister groups of the tenrecs, or the mongooses, or the sister group of the euplerids, galagos and lemurs, etc. Unfortunately, these studies by and large are poorly studied in terms of their social systems, but at least we found enough data on body size to look at sexual size dimorphism, and comparing these lineages with each other. You can see that actually in 3 of the 4 radiations, the transfer to Madagascar resulted in a reduction in sexual size dimorphism. And there is some indication that's actually due to the fact that, females became a bit bigger, reducing the initial size advantage of males in Africa. Okay, lots of details. So let's, for the last couple of minutes, zoom out a bit and look at the big picture here. Ignoring all the details, what can we say about convergence and divergence at the radiation level? I think there are 2 main points to be made here. One is that we actually see in Madagascar the evolution of the same basic types of social systems, so solitary, pair living, group living, which is in itself, not obvious perhaps, but reassuring. But then when we look at the exact patterning of the systems and their dynamics over evolutionary time, there's some interesting deviations from the better studied anthropoids. So if we look at the 15 genera of lemurs that are depicted by a representative here, and just look at whether a particular genus has solitary pair living or group living or any combination thereof species in it, it's striking that actually in 4 of these genera we find 2 categories of social organization, which is not radically sensational, but compared to the anthropoid primates, at least, it's actually remarkable, because in the remaining anthropoids together, we maybe have another 4 genera or so where we find this type of variation at this level. A more detailed formal reconstruction of the evolution of the social organization of these animals, together with my former postdoc Luca Pozzi, revealed 2 interesting points in this context. One is that despite the small group size and the small absolute number of adult females in these lemur groups, none of them is consistently characterized by a one male, multi-female social organization in the group living species. And the other important point is illustrated here, in that group living evolved independently in the lemur family and over here in the Indri family. And it only evolved one more additional time at the base of the anthropoids in the remaining primates. Lemurs are also then interesting in terms of the distribution, or more precisely, the frequency of pair living, because it's found, as highlighted here, in 4 or 5 of the families, half of the genera, and if we sort of, conservatively approximate or estimate the level at the species level, up to 30% of the lemur species could be pair living, which is relatively frequent compared to other primates. And as I've shown earlier in a previous study, the evolutionary transitions to pair living among the Malagasy lemurs is interesting, because there were 2 transitions, one from solitary species where we can identify various intermediate stages, or can reconstruct with some good arguments how the evolution of pairs may have progressed. But, and in this respect, lemurs are really even unusual among mammals. There are also cases where formally, or where group living ancestral species gave rise to pair living species. And looking in more detail at the evolution of pair living and the variability in pair living primates, this is the last point I want to make. Luca Pozzi and I discovered that there appears to be 3 types of pair living primates. If we count simply the number of pairs, in individual species, where this detail has been provided for a whole population or study population. And there appears to be a number of species shown in black here where we found no deviation. So these species can live in pairs that always include 1 adult female and 1 adult male. Then we have some species here in the middle in dark gray where there's some deviation. So where there's sometimes an additional male or sometimes an additional female, or maybe even one of each. So only a smaller proportion of the social units is actually pair living. And then there appears to be yet another category where pair living is an occasional observation, but the majority of the groups or the social units in these species are actually not pairs. So again, the take-home message here is pair living is not the same, and there's a lot of variation that needs to be explained and appreciated. So, if you remember, an hour ago, I identified or proposed one frontier in the study of social evolution that, links studies of phylogeny or studies of social systems in a phylogenetic context and the studies of the lemurs that I've summarized here indicated that there is a lot of variation, even within species, but also genera and families, which is quite interesting, especially given the evolutionary divergence, as far as we know it from molecular studies. Some of these genera have only diverged into different species an order of 1, 2, 3 million years ago. Families have been separated for about 20 to 40 million years, just to give you an idea. But then even comparing different families, we see some convergent patterns, like in the chirogalids and the lepilemurs, we find dispersed pairs. Indrids and lemurids independently involved group living, and indrids and lemurids independently evolved these traits that characterize the lemur syndrome. So in this case, looking at this particular radiation seems to suggest that there is rapid convergent evolution. But then the data that I presented more recently also indicate that there is a second frontier that we should perhaps explore in more detail. So the notion that we should explore the variation that is beyond the species classification. That's really interesting, thinking about the variation in pair living species that I just talked about. And you can also think about variation in other aspects like the bonding or extra per pair paternity, etc., exclusivity, something that I'm reviewing at the moment. But also when we think about the solitary species, something that came up during Lauren's talk a few weeks ago, that there might be differences like day and night if you actually look at these animals during the day and during the night and look at their social constellations. There are certain social attractors that might be important. There are environmental constraints that might be driving association patterns in these species that we need to understand in more detail. And finally, also thinking about the group living species, I think there are good reasons to think in a more differentiated way. My PhD student Leah Prox, for her master thesis, together with Damien Farine, has identified additional dimensions of social organization that could be profitably evaluated, especially with respect to the group living species. So there's lots that can and should be done concerning this second frontier. So to summarize, I hope I could show you today and give you an overview about the diverse and variable lemur social systems, really remarkable. There is variation within taxonomic levels, but there's also convergence between families, which is quite informative about the kinds of problems these animals are facing. Stepping one step back, I think we saw that the lemurs converge with other primates in some very fundamental traits, but apparently they also found alternative solutions, for example, to manage their pair living And also when you think about female dominance topic, so sex roles are not written in stone as we tend to refer to the traditional sex roles. And many of these insights depend, of course, as in the case of the Kirindi studies, on long-term efforts in the field that you really need to know your animals and their individual histories. But also I want to emphasize this again here on conservation action, because when we try to get a complete overview of the diversity of lemur social systems, I find it sad and remarkable that as of today in 2020, about 2/3 of all known lemur species remain completely unstudied in the field. So in most of the cases, only one or a handful of individuals has been captured, genotyped, species described, and that's all we know. And in another 10 years, I think we will have lost many of them. And so in terms of the general conclusions, looking at the frontiers that one could perhaps identify based on this work, is that it's really interesting, at least to me, to study the pace of evolutionary change across different levels of the phylogenies in more detail, and also to dig deeper into more dimensions of the different types of social organization. All of this work is entirely the fault and result of many wonderful people, foremost our Malagasy field assistants who are out there even in the times of COVID on a daily basis, censusing and observing and capturing our animals. So because of these wonderful fellows up here, we haven't lost a day of data collection this year, which is really just the tip of the iceberg of what they've been doing for the last 25 years. All of this was, of course, also only possible because of constant support by various Malagasy partners, institutions, funding agencies, and not the least by my dear wife and long-term field companion, Claudia Fichtel. But most of the data that I presented today were actually collected and processed by this group of former and current PhD students and postdocs, and I'm most grateful to all of them for contributing to this data set, and thank you for your patience and for your attention.
Thank you very much, Peter. That was really a fascinating talk. I have to say I learned a lot, and there's even more I start thinking about now. Now, for everyone, you might already know the procedure. If you do have a question, then please type within the chat a question mark, then you see where in line you are, and then I will moderate it, say who is supposed to ask a question now, please. Also, the people on YouTube, I will also once in a while check whether questions are on the YouTube page. And when it's your time, please, even though we do know each other now pretty well, we don't know everyone, and introduce yourself quickly, say what's your name, where you're coming from, and then ask your question. And the first person to start the discussion would be Filippo, please.
Let me see. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Peter, fantastic, great talk, and not only all the details on your work on the lemurs, but just the framework, and as usual, very inspiring. And you basically highlight a lot of things, and you focus on social organization. And even then, at the end, you say that basically there could be more on social organization than what you could have presented. Yeah. And I'm, as you know, I'm very fond of your framework of the social system, focusing on the 3 and now 4 aspects on social organization. But in one aspect of social system, in one aspect of social organization, you have the spatial temporal variation that I'm particularly fond because it's linked to fission-fusion dynamics. So my question is, of all the species you have studied and all the variation you actually encounter, did you find variation on the spatial temporal variation? Because you mentioned clearly on the solitary species, you show data on ranging, so that you could get a bit of a sense of that. But you see that more the spatial variation, not necessarily the temporal variation. Mm-hmm. So my question is, within the social organization, so did you find similar convergence and divergence with other within the families and species that you discussed it, and then across the private order?
So thanks, Pippo. If I understand correctly, then I would say that the best example where we have much information comes from the gray mouse lemurs, where we have, you know, the day and night variation, and presumably also, if we look at it in more detail, you know, seasonal variation in terms of environmental seasonality, resource fluctuations. But these animals are active by themselves as solitary foragers during the night, but then in the early morning, they come together in various subgroups and only to disperse again then at the end of the day for the next bout of activity. And so I'm not sure whether you are interested in that type of flexibility. So that's reassuring. The other example that comes to mind, but that's a species that remains a mystery, and I've never worked with them myself, are the ruffed lemurs, Verreaux.
Yeah, I know.
Which have been classified as, you know, pair living, group living, fission fusion, because they seem to be doing something different again, and nobody has really, to my knowledge, figured out what exactly they're doing. But so that would be also an excellent candidate for, you know, the kind of things that you're interested in.
Yeah. Can I follow up with the basically, now you mentioned about the case of the Verreaux with there's no clear what is basically the social organization, if you want to. US showed a lot of variation in at least some species between pair living and group living species, a group living a social organization within the same species. As far as you know, this is between groups that are basically in that type of social organization for a long period of time, or there is variation within the same group on a rather short term. So they can be pair and then group living and then pair again, the same individuals, let's say.
No, I mean, as I said, lemurs are cool and they're smart and flexible, but they're not that flexible. The temporal scale on which we see this type of variation is really due to demographic events. So that a given group, you know, that has multi-male, multi-female today through predation, immigration, etc., may melt down to a pair next year, and, you know, so at that level, yes, but not more flexibly.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Then the next question is by Eduardo.
Hi, I'm Eduardo Fernandez Duque at Yale. Thank you, Peter, for a wonderful talk. I really appreciate it. You have really set up the bar very, very high for those of us trying to have some kind of a comparative approach to our research questions. I don't expect that we will settle on any type of concrete answer or solution to what I want to bring up. I mean, but I think that I share with you the idea that it's just about trying to make progress and somebody else continuing to make this progress. In one of the papers that you recommended that we read, you were making the point that how important it is that we have to agree on at least some basic definitions that will allow us to make more solid progress. I mean, I thought it was very interesting how you said that it's really hurting our I think you used the word reputation as scientists when we cannot even agree on that. And so what I want to bring up as something that I'd like to hear from you, how you're thinking about it, is what makes an individual an adult. And the reason I mentioned that is because in one of the last slides you showed, as you were describing the percentage of pairs for any given taxa that are reported, the percentage of pairs. I noticed that for Calicebus discolor, the data reported is 80%. And so I don't want to get into the data per se. I don't know where it comes from. It doesn't matter. But particularly when we're looking at pair living taxa, how are we going to come up with some kind of operational definition of what makes it an adult? And I bring this up because it has caused Tony and myself lots and lots of conversations. You go to the field and you find 3 similarly sized owl monkeys, or titties, or well, sakis, they have some dimorphism. And then what? You're not talking just going from 6 to 7 adults in a large group. You're talking, this is a qualitative change in everything we're interested in understanding. If I come back saying there are 2 adult females or 1 adult female. So I'm just curious, what do you suggest as we try to improve on how we're going to be talking about adults?
Yeah, that's of course a fundamental question for all those who are trying to classify species and compare them with each other. Also something that has come up in discussions with Carsten and Charlotte earlier today. And I think the answer is very easy at the individual level. As soon as sexual maturity is achieved, you have by definition an adult. Our problem is that we often do not know whether they're sexually active or mature when we observe them. And so for comparative studies where you're gleaning information from the literature, I'm guessing everybody else have simply to trust the authors that they have put some criteria into defining age categories for their animals. And when they say group composition is 1 male and 2 females, that we have to work with that. If you're in the shoes of somebody who, like you, who's doing the field work and trying to provide these data in the necessary detail, I think the only answer and solution is long-term studies, because then you will know the ages, the histories of all the members of these social units that you're studying. And you will know whether, one of them gave birth last year, or you may have genetic data indicating paternity of somebody that's also, new in the group or whatever. But other than that, just, taking snapshots of individual groups, I think will always contain a risk that we do not know the exact ages, that in particular we may confuse old offspring from previous years with immigrants. And, so really you need long-term demography and genetic data to have the kind of resolution that you and I want.
Okay, then I put in a question mark for myself to be able to ask questions from YouTube to keep the people there happy. And Tobias van Erls is asking, he first says, thank you for this intriguing talk. And he asks, what are the patterns of relatedness in lemur social groups? For instance, are females or males in multi-male, multi-female groups related? So this is of course an important part of social organization. It relates to Eduardo's question about, is there a general pattern about relatedness in female in lemur groups?
Yeah, so that's a good point, important point. Thanks for bringing it up. And we actually did some genetic studies actually to infer the paternities of many of the study animals. But these genetic analyses revealed that in both of the group living species that I talked about today, the females are closely related and form the cores of these groups, and that males typically emigrate from their natal group at sexual maturity, entering into a neighboring group in the neighborhood, so that the reproductively active adult males in a group are unrelated with the resident females. There are always some individuals, a similar problem like we just discussed with Eduardo, that you have an adult male that has chosen to delay his departure from the natal group. And so without knowing the history of that individual or without the genetic tests, it would be difficult to know why this male behaves differently in the mating season. But as I said, we're fortunate enough that we can capture these animals, get tissue samples, do all the genetic analysis. And so we have this information.
Good, thank you. Then the next one to ask a question would be Kaya, please.
Hi, I'm Kaya Tambach. I'm from Hunter College. I'm in a postdoc in Jess Rothman's lab. I wanted to ask about the lemur syndrome and so if females are becoming or have become more masculinized, possibly as a result of the energetic constraints that have led them to potentially become more aggressive or dominant to get more resources and enable reproduction, why wouldn't other females in other situations do that also to maximize their fitness? So in other words, what is the trade-off, and do you see costs of this masculinization in those systems and potential adaptations against those costs?
So with other females, you mean outside of Madagascar?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That's of course an obvious, brilliant question that has come up repeatedly, and nobody really knows an answer. And I'm one of the people who cannot really tell you why something that may turn out to be an adaptive solution found by the lemurs to be absent in South African vervet monkeys or Jacma baboon females, which also live in very harsh conditions, pronounced seasonality, etc. So in principle, they should be subject to the same selective pressures. And I think we can agree that that is probably the case, depending on maybe some details in the climatic variability or phenology data that we usually also don't have available. And then the question is, why did they not come up with the same solution? And here we enter the terrain of speculation, and maybe in the context of what I presented today, this is just an example of something that happened to be invented by the lemurs and has proven adaptive there, which would be a weak possibility, given also one of my arguments that we find the physiological effects of maternal stress during pregnancy, also in guinea pigs and even in some life-bearing fish. So that's really appears to be an old, deeply rooted physiological mechanism that appears to be available to everybody based on the similarity between corticosteroids and sex steroids. So all you need is one enzyme to transform them, and then stress hormones are turned into sex hormones, which can then produce the developmental effects that we observe. But why we don't see that widely in other taxa, I don't know. It's, yeah, great question, but unsatisfying answer.
Yeah, this is science. If we would have answers to everything, we would be in church now, not on Zoom meeting all over the world to discuss questions like this. Then the next question comes from Dolly.
Yeah, hello everyone. I'm Dolly. I'm from Assam, India, and I'm currently working with Karsten in Carnivore Social Organization. So my question is similar to what Kaya just asked, and it's kind of a basic question. Probably I missed while you were saying it. So I didn't understand how maternal stress results in feminization in sons. Like, I can understand masculinization in daughters, but how and why does it result in feminization in sons?
I'm having, I don't know if it's only me, but a bit of a technical problem. So I only got every other word of your question. So I don't know if Karsten, if you got...
The way I understood it, at least it's also a question I had, is you might explain how this female competition leads to masculinization of daughters, but to get a reduction of, or to have no sexual dimorphism, especially not that they're all full of muscles and big canines, you would also need the sons to become more like females.
Yeah.
That the sexual dimorphism goes away, if that's the way I understood it. Can you make like this, Dolly, if I understood it right, or otherwise?
Yeah, so I can try to answer that question as well, even though this is a domain where we obviously don't have any data from the lemurs, except for some correlational studies done by Christine Drea at the Duke Lemur Center. But you're right, there is the corresponding effect in young males that has been described for, at least I'm familiar with a set of studies on guinea pigs, where the males produced by stressed mothers are noticeably, feminized in aspects of their behavior, to the extent that they even show lordosis and other female typical behaviors in certain situations. So that's the behavioral level in terms of, long-term effects that we tend to measure in the degree of sexual size dimorphism. That's exactly the question that we try to address in this study, comparing Malagasy mammals with their African relatives. Because if you find a reduction in the average degree of sexual size dimorphism, there are two possibilities which are not mutually exclusive. So either females have become bigger or the males have become smaller, or both. And overall, we have some weak indicators, but also not consistently across the four groups that we look at, for females to increase in size once they made it to Madagascar, thereby perhaps contributing more to this disappearance of sexual size dimorphism. But then you can always ask, and rightly so, that body size continues to be an important mechanism in male-male competition, which should, be advantageous there and continue to place a premium on male body size over evolutionary times, not favoring a reduction, but it shows also that that's perhaps the important message to take away from this, that despite these many studies of sexual dimorphism in itself is not a trait, but we're just constructing something that is the result of independent selection on male and female body size as a result of sex-specific reproductive strategies. And so this example illustrates, I think, that male and female body size can and do evolve independently.
Okay, then I have a question.
Thank you so much.
Then I have a question myself. I mean, I think it's really important, your studies in Kirindi over so many decades on so many different species you have in this forest, and you could find that, if I got it right, out of these 6 nocturnal species, only 3 are solitary living and 3 are actually pair living. And you rightfully pointed out at the very end of your talk that for most lemur species, we still do not know really their social organizations, they have not been studied. But still, at the end of your talk, you also showed your figure from your article in Advances in Science. You have this phylogeny of lemurs, and there's so many black lemurs that are said to be solitary living. So my question is, how many of these lemurs that are there categorized as solitary living have really been studied, that we know they are solitary, and might this picture not change dramatically if there would be more effort into the kind of fieldwork you've been doing for decades?
Yeah, so I actually, I don't know if Luca is still in the line. He may recall these details, but of course we also face these problems of classification, and our strategy was to use several data sets with varying assumptions and to repeat some of these analyses. And of course you can do a very broad picture comparative analysis with certain assumptions that increases your sample size, and you can also do a more conservative approach with a more restricted sample size. And what is true, so I don't know with respect to that particular figure, I would have to look at it again to answer you precisely, but you should find it in the supplementary material if you're interested in the detail. But I agree with you that there might be hidden variation that's not appreciated at this level. But my counter argument would be that this would probably not lead, in this case, to a different picture, because if we have some information about the species, even though it's based only on a short field study and very incomplete, and there are many examples like this in Madagascar, you would know, or at least have some strong indications that there are reasons for an alternative classification as pair living species, for example, or as group living, which would be unusual for a solitary species. So I think as long as you make your comparisons at that level of the 3 types of social systems, there's always a risk of making an error, and we try to minimize those with the available information. But I think it is not likely to change completely.
Okay, then the next question is by Alexa, please.
Hi, thank you for the talk. And I'm Alexa, I'm at Yale, and Eduardo is my advisor. In relation to one of your recommended readings and also the question that Eduardo asked, David Wood and I spent last semester disentangling the definitions of convergent evolution, parallelism, and divergence, and there isn't really any consensus about the definitions in the literature. And I think that you defined convergent evolution as unrelated organisms, evolved structures, morphological features, and other traits with similar function. And I'm wondering how you distinguish this from parallelism. Is parallelism to you occurring between closely related species, or are you really trying to get at underlying synapomorphies or precursors for developing a condition? And a follow-up question to that is how you reconcile with these differences in definitions when you're conducting your own research.
Yeah, that's of course also an important question. And to me, the important difference is that between convergence and homology that we need to separate in these comparative analyses. And I think they, the definitions of these two concepts include the essential component related to the relatedness of the taxa that you're comparing, that also guides then the comparative analysis and the conclusions that you can draw from them. And so I agree that it's important to have clear and explicit definitions of these terms, but I'm actually not aware of any major controversies about them. So I'd be happy to hear more about them if you have any papers or other information.
Yeah, I will definitely send you an email with some of the historical papers that we looked at and how they changed over time.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thanks.
Great, then there would have been some questions by Sari van Baerle, but she wrote she had to leave, so she can't ask anymore. So this is why we now have Filippo can ask his second question, please.
Yeah, and sorry, I apologize that I didn't introduce myself first. So it's Filippo Relli from Universidad Veracruzana in Mexico. And my question is related to Kaya's question and Peter's answer. And I feel like that the female dominance seen as a female-female competition is just one of the various ways females can deal with competition. And Peter mentioned very clearly that lemurs do not have coalitions. So the vervets example that Peter mentioned, the vervets have coalitions. And so female-female form coalitions, and that's a way they solve that issue. Now, there is interesting other things, and this I already had in mind, but I incorporate a comment that Suleima mentioned. They are the spotted hyenas. They are the famous female dominance structure, but they also have coalitions. So then you have a species in which they have a female-female coalition and female dominance with the masculinization. So, and then you could come up with all sorts of other species. For instance, Peter mentioned the chacma baboons, in which possibly there is no masculinization and there is no coalition. And I think we have already only using two of the tactics, let's say, to solve the issue, masculinization and actually, this is interesting because the masculinization in lemurs is not then very clearly over. So there's no then very much aggression. So compared to the hyenas. So also we don't know precisely that masculinization what leads in terms of competition, in over competition directly. But the coalitions, we know it. So even in this case, we have a kind of a 2x2 situation in which you have two different strategies, and then different species fits in the various components. So, and I think I'm sure we can come up with other strategies to deal with female-female competition, and then the situation becomes more complex, but probably then some nice comparative analysis led by Peter could go somewhere.
Thanks for the inspiring comment. I just defer the question to, or the task to
team then.
Charlotte, yeah, who's studying all the mammals, and
All right, correct. Yeah.
so she will have the big picture.
Very well. I would like to mention there's many people that say thank you very much for an exciting talk, like Juliette Achette on or actually on YouTube. Then Karen Hook said she really enjoyed it, but she had to leave, as does Suleima. I don't see any other questions here at the moment, so I take the liberty to ask one more question, even though you kind of addressed it, maybe even repeatedly in your talk. You showed this variation in pair living. Now, let's talk only about lemurs, where you have, I'm not sure about in primates, where you have these kind of dispersed pairs, and then like in Aotus or in Phylogeny, you have pairs that are very close together. And at the end, you mentioned some other aspects that one could measure in these pair living primates. What from your point of view, also for a measure that is applicable in the field, would be a most interesting measure from the social structure to put these different forms of pair living species into a kind of category? Would it be something like social distancing, like you showed in the one paper, how much time they actually do spend together? Because I think in the end it will be rather continuous, or will it be really two different classes of pair living dispersed and ones that are very close together?
Well, yeah, I mean, again, we don't know the full amount or extent of variation that exists, but this is clearly something that deserves more study. Even in the few pair living lemurs that we've been studying, we find variation in the social cohesion, at least, in that in one of the lepi lemur species from southern Madagascar that one of my PhD students, Iris Tröscher, studied in great detail, we find essentially complete separation, segregation of males and females sharing the same home range, with zero grooming or other interactions throughout the year. Also no shared shelter use. In the lepi lemur species at Kirindi, there is more variation, at least in the shared shelter use, and in the fork-marked lemur, which I presented first. There's even excellent data from Oliver Schülke showing that the different pairs that he studied seem to vary consistently in how many times of the study period they chose to spend together during the day in the same tree hole. The average was something like about 30%. So there's lots of interesting variation only looking at the day-night behavior. It's generally easier, I think, than with some other species and pair living species to also do parallel observations, something that we've done, follow male and female simultaneously. For those interested, Claudia did an analysis of the coordination and synchronization of the pair mates within a pair, but then, just to complete the answer, there are perhaps even more dimensions. That's why I refer to this, as at least 5 dimensions. What has been mentioned by many students of pair living animals in captivity is the existence of a pair bond, which is somehow a physiological construct which should be measurable. So if one has the opportunity to get fecal samples, for example, one could also look at endocrine correlates of bond strength and whether it exists and how it's manifested or how it varies across the seasons. So there's still lots and lots to do with pair living species.
Yeah, thank you. So no other question to follow up on this and to get very imprecise, which I don't actually like, but it's the end of the discussion. This term of social monogamy, whatever this is, has often been said to be a hallmark of mammalian social evolution, some like implying it's something very complex. Might it be that the component of social organization to live in pairs, dispersed or not, might be not so complex to evolve compared to the component of social structure you just mentioned, which is pair bonding, that maybe the hallmark of social evolution is rather pair bonding than living in pairs?
Yeah, I think that, yeah, that's an important point. Well, of course, we also lack, sufficient data, but everybody was probably asleep towards the end of the talk, where I glossed over a big table, with many lemurs and lots of text, where I tried to show, given information on extant species, both solitary and pair living, how different components of the pair living social system could have evolved by putting different layers on top of each other. So just going from a completely asocial solitary animal to a caring, loving, huddling, fully pair bonded species is probably not something that's very realistic. And so the idea is that there are certain pre-adaptations also in the way, infants are cared for, etc., that allow gradual transitions to build upon each other and to get there. And if we do such a cross-sectional analysis, then it's also possible to, reconstruct these shots, at least in a plausible way. I mean, it's not a very powerful type of analysis, but at least it's informative, and more informative than to just look at the phylogenetic tree and say, oh, there was a transition from solitary to pair living, because it's not one switch, but probably multiple small switches that have to be turned on in the right order over long periods of time.
Yeah, thank you very much for an interesting, fascinating talk. Thank you for everyone to participating and staying with us for